We are very happy to welcome you today to the 10th ITMN Seminar. The seminar will be given by Ana Bastos. I'm very happy to have her here today. Ana just received the EGU Biogeosciences Division Outstanding Early Career Scientist Award, and she is the head of the Climate Ecosystem Disturbance Interactions Group at the Max Planck Institute in Jena, Germany. Ana is originally from Portugal and did her bachelor in physics. Later, she continued with a master in environment and engineering and also did her PhD at the University of Lisbon in Portugal. She is an expert, I would say, on extreme events and attributing extreme events and also translating the impacts of extremes onto ecosystems. So we are very happy to have Ana here with us today, and we are really looking forward to your talk, Ana. So the floor is yours, and yeah, welcome.
Thank you, and thanks a lot for the invitation. And so, as Nadine just said, my background is really on, for a start, I did my PhD in meteorology department, and so only later I started moving towards the ecology side. And so my talk today will try to bridge these different fields and try to bring together these different perspectives to try to understand high impact ecological events. And here I'm showing a figure taken by the MODIS satellite during the heat and drought event in 2018, when for a big part of vegetation in Europe was really under stress. And the idea is to try to understand what drives this kind of cloud-free, very nice, sunny, but also hot and dry pattern that drove this high impact extreme event. And I will talk about other processes as well. So there will be some times where there will be a lot on kind of atmospheric or climate science. And I hope this can nevertheless be of use to some of you. And so I would like to start by definitions, and it might sound boring, but I think definitions really matter. And if we look at the literature, there's many different types of ways of defining these events that we all know they happened, but people define them in different ways. So sometimes we hear about climate extremes and their impacts, extreme climatic events, ecosystem disturbances. And my feeling is that they are to some extent signs of different disciplines looking at the same thing with different perspectives. So if we think about the climate extreme definition from kind of IPCC-like definition, we can think about some climate variable or more climate variables having a distribution over a given long enough reference period. And then an extreme event is a value that stands outside of the distribution, either very low or very high. And these events can be either weather events or extreme climate events. And in this talk, I will also refer to both of these types of extreme events as climate extremes. We know that climate extremes have multiple impacts on ecosystem processes, and that they can impact directly or indirectly, so that the overall responses might be actually more complex than just a direct negative or positive impact. And because of this, about a decade ago, there was a paper by Melinda Smith that really was really important in my PhD, where basically an extreme climatic event was defined in that an extreme event only was of interest to ecological processes if it would also induce an extreme response by ecosystems. And so these events would require an extreme character of both the driver and the response. And that the response would also have to be kind of well outside the bounds of normal variability. And if we think about the definition of disturbances from more from the ecology, this is in a way similar. We have an event that disrupts ecosystem, community, population, structure functioning, but with the difference that in disturbance definitions, normally the events don't necessarily have to be extreme, and disturbances are also normally thought about or analyzed in terms not just of the extreme event itself, but also how it relates to the recovery intervals and the recurrence of these events, and then also their extent in relationship to the landscape extent. And so if we think about these three different types of definitions, climate extremes are based purely on physical variables and are impact agnostic in the sense that one does not necessarily care about the impact to define the event itself. The extreme climatic events definition has a hierarchy of climatic drivers to ecological responses, and both have to be extreme, while disturbances can include different drivers from abiotic to biotic and also human, and the impact does not necessarily have to be extreme. So I was curious about this some time ago, and I searched in the Web of Science for drought impacts and how they are categorized, or in the papers, whether they are appear in combination with climate extreme impacts or as disturbances for different kind of community journals. And you can see that the papers associating drought impacts with disturbances were much more predominated by biology, ecology journals, while the field of climate extremes, or the definition of climate extremes, was had a bigger share in the hydrometeorology and the kind of multidisciplinary environmental sciences. And the reason why these definitions also matter is that in many cases, or in many papers, drought is not even really defined. So there was this nice paper a few years ago showing that in most of ecology studies, drought is not defined with the quantitative terms, and even when there's many different ways of defining drought that can range from something that is very generalized dry, this departure from normal, a standardized index, but also in some cases can already relate to the impact itself, whether it's reflected in plant stress. And so the point I would like to make here is that these definitions, if they're unclear or inconsistent, they might hamper our process understanding, because we might be talking about the same thing, but looking at, or we might think we are talking about the same thing, but in the end, we might not. And so just to give an example, again, in summer 2018 in Europe, there was a strong drought. So here I'm showing standardized soil moisture anomalies in summer 2018, and the red shows an area under extreme drought. And like 2 years ago, we looked at the corresponding anomalies in net carbon uptake during the same period. And we've seen that there was a negative anomaly in kind of the southern sector affected by drought, but actually positive anomalies to the north. And so if we look at this from a climate extreme perspective, we could define this as our region of interest. And then the question we could ask is, these regions are affected by the same kind of climatic conditions. What drives the different responses? And is this related to different resistant patterns? Is it related to different legacy from past history? And I will talk a little bit later about this again. But what I would like to point out here is that if we would look at the problem from an extreme climatic event definition, then we would probably focus only on this very small region where there's the stippling, which shows that the response itself was extremely negative. Eventually, one could also look at this positive stippling, but at least I think it's not very common then when one looks to the impacts to look also at the positive impacts. If we would look at this from kind of a broader disturbance perspective, maybe we would also focus on a bigger region where NBP, so net carbon uptake, departed was from the normal variability, but not necessarily extreme, so we could increase our field of study. And these different ways of looking at the problem would necessarily lead maybe to a partial picture on what actually happened during this event. And so I've been trying to make sense and try to bring together these definitions, because I think all of them have important parts and valuable parts. And so I've been trying to think about how we could maybe try to come up with a definition that could aggregate the two communities. And I will give two examples that I think have of attempts to improve these definitions from a climatic risk perspective and an ecology perspective, and then I will show how maybe we can combine these two. So the first is the climate risk perspective, and there's been a lot of research into the compound events field, where events are defined as a combination of multiple drivers or hazards that can contribute to a societal or environmental risk. And in the compound events framework, one can also define modulators that affect the drivers, and then the modulator, and then climate change can also influence each of these three terms that result in a given impact. From the ecology side, I really like this paper by Deborah Peters, where in a way, it's doing the same thing. It's disaggregating disturbances into drivers, mechanisms, and changes in the system properties. And then the advantage is that first it considers initial system properties, but also disturbance legacies and recovery dynamics, which is something that is not considered in the climate risk perspective, for at least for hydrometeorologic events, because normally these memory effects are at least less important than the actual events. And so trying to group these things, we can think about compound events having a clear separation of drivers, hazards, and impacts. And there's been also some research trying to define different types of events. So preconditioned, multivariate, temporally compounding, spatially compounding, and also developing specific ways to analyze each of these events. So specific methods that can be more adequate to analyze each of these. One challenge is that when we want to apply these frameworks to ecological problems, we might need to do a lot of adaptations and also combine different events. And so this is, again, an example about, can also be related with this 2018 drought in Europe. And in ecology, well, first, all events are to some extent multivariate, because plants don't respond only to a single climate driver. They're also preconditioned to a certain extent because the initial system properties matter, and they're affected by past history as well. So this legacies and memory effects are important. And then an important aspect is that there's no consideration to what happens after the event itself. So there's no consideration of recovery dynamics. On the other hand, the disaggregated perspective on disturbances considers initial system properties, recovery dynamics, legacy effects, and then the drivers are classified into climatic or atmospheric, physical, biotic, and anthropogenic. And so in a way, it's similar, but here I think there's some challenges because the drivers can interact. So for example, if we think about fire dynamics in Southeast Asia, that's mainly driven by management fires, but then there's a modulation of these fires by the El Nino or the drought induced by El Nino events, because the dry conditions then make it much easier that fires run out of control, even though they are ignited by people in their management daily life. another challenge is that some drivers actually can control the others. And there's this really nice paper by Rupert showing that for many disturbances, climate controls directly or indirectly many of these disturbances. So in the sense, the climatic drivers could then drive the biotic drivers and then result in disturbances. And so, well, I try to bring these things together and basically try to define something that could be called ecological compound events, where we can define a clear hierarchy of drivers, starting by climatic drivers, and also kind of normal variability, but also global change. And global change can also be other things beyond climate that then induce certain hazards. It might also indirectly affect some ecological modulators that can be phenological dynamics, it can be physiology, structure and composition at longer timescales, and things like this. And that then both together can affect the disturbance hazard, so drought, fire danger, extreme wind, etc., and then result in given impacts that we can define as any variable of interest. And here, I think an important thing is to consider that the impact sign, the sign of the impact and the strength can also be question dependent, because sometimes we might be interested in starting in the climate driver and then see how some event in the climate space affects hazards and then in turn affects impacts, because maybe we are interested in learning how the ecological modulators might affect these relationships. And then this ecological modulators could also include past legacies as preconditioning effects, and in principle could also include management effects. And so if we think about these events, we can also define events as preconditioned, multivariate, temporally compounding, and spatially compounding, even though in principle there's different, normally they would occur in combinations. An important aspect is this hierarchy of drivers that then I think might make things easier to separate in terms of analysis and quantification of causal relationships, and hopefully improve process understanding. And of course, all these knowing which functions relate to each of these errors depends, of course, on either data availability or model capabilities. But in principle, the point I would like to make here is that this climate-centered driver definition might help us understand the system as a whole. And I will start, okay, so I will now move to some examples because this has been quite dry until now, I think. And just to show how this can work in practice, again, we're interested in understanding this difference between negative impacts under drought in summer 2018 and positive impacts under similar drought conditions in the north. And one of the things that we know is that spring in 2018 was also very warm, quite dry, and also there were very few clouds, so radiation was very high. This stimulated spring productivity, which in turn increased evapotranspiration. And there were some differences between land cover types in how the drivers affected these two terms. And then we can then look at summer climate anomalies. Again, was very hot, very dry, and there were very few clouds. And we could separate these two effects and show that the preconditioning effect of the warm spring through increases in evapotranspiration contributed to about 50% of the summer drought, and the actual summer climate anomalies contributed to the other half of the summer drought. And then in turn, one of the things that we've also shown was that this preconditioning effect of increased productivity during spring then also resulted in different consequences in summer, depending on water use strategies by crops and forests differently. And so crop-dominated areas in the south if it had a very high evapotranspiration, depleted all the water, and then in summer could not keep functioning anymore, while forests in the north increase a little bit the water use efficiency. And in fact, this extra LAI probably also helped supporting higher productivity in summer. Another example is the sequence of 2 hot summers. So this would be a temporally compounding event, and considering disturbance legacies. Following summer 2018, there was again a very hot and dry summer in Central Europe. And we can see here EVI anomalies in 2018 in Central Europe, and then in 2019 as well. And so we can think about the heat and drought event in 2018 leaving a preconditioning effect of a soil moisture deficit in 2018. And also we can think about the summer, the impacts of the 2018 summer also potentially being a preconditioning effect for the impacts of a second hot and dry summer. So then we can look at how high temperature and low rainfall lead to hot and dry conditions again in 2019, sorry. And then for most pixels in this region, we defined 4 clusters that showed different trajectories between the 2 summers. So some pixels actually show some greening, even though they were still under drought and it was still hotter than normal. And then other pixels showed partial recovery, and then others showed in both summers strong impacts. And these 3 clusters, even though they had their some differences, we could basically relate to differences in land cover affecting resistance and vulnerability to the concurrent hot and dry summer. But for about 20% of the pixels, we saw a decline in greening, so a browning trend from between one year and the next, even though this did not correspond to an increase in the drought conditions. And here we really try to relate with the preconditioning effect of the past summer through damage or increased stress. But also many of these regions corresponded to areas where we know there's been outbreaks of bark beetles, and later Cornelius Senf actually has a recent paper showing an increase in disturbance in many of these regions. And so for these 20%, there's also some preconditioning effect of the past disturbance history, increasing the hazard for bark beetle outbreaks, and then leading to an increased impact. So, okay, so I hope this might convince you that looking at these events from a hierarchy from climate to hazards and to impacts makes sense and might help us understand how these processes translate into impacts. And now I would like to talk about understanding variability, extremes, and trends in these kinds of events. And so I will now be talking always about compound ecological events or extreme events, always from this perspective. And again, I will try to bring some climate atmospheric perspective to some of the questions that we work in. And so the first thing to ask is what drives ecological variability in a stationary climate, so a climate with no human-driven climate change. And we can think about some ecosystem variable of interest showing some variability. And here I'm borrowing this very nice scheme from Craig Allen's paper. And so we can define some stress threshold and some mortality threshold, which might be crossed once in a while. And we might have very rarely some high impact ecological compound events. An example could be a very large wildfire during a summer thunderstorm in North America, for example. And so the point here is that high impact events are still expected to happen even under pre-industrial climate conditions. And in the sense, they should be driven by some distribution of natural climate variability driven by, so this kind of high impact ecological compound event is in principle driven by some extreme or some combination of unusual conditions driven by natural variability in the climate system, and then transformed by some function which relates the climate anomalies through some sensitivity to the climate conditions into a given impact. So I would just like to make a small parenthesis about natural climate variability, just to make sure everyone is on the same page. And we know that climate varies at multiple timescales from kind of days to millennia. And one of the important aspects of this natural variability is that it is a big source of uncertainty in future climate projections, and it is an obstacle to identify changes that are driven by anthropogenic climate change. And so these variations can include periodic externally forced variations like the daily cycle or the seasonal cycles. They can also relate to nonlinear interactions between different components of the climate system. For example, ice albedo feedbacks that can also happen at different timescales. And they can also be associated with random fluctuations in physical or chemical variables. And so one example of an external fluctuation that external to climate would be, for example, a volcanic eruption. And then there can be internal variations, which can be weather patterns, like shown in the video here, just some kind of normal variability in atmospheric circulation that is more or less chaotic. And then also interannual to multidecadal modes of atmospheric variability. And the important thing here is that from the daily to seasonal cycles, the predictability is quite high, while as we go to these kind of internal variability patterns, the predictability is quite reduced. And so we can think about, in addition to natural climate variability, that should also be some internal dynamics that affects the response of the system. So it's not all, we know that it's not all just, oscillating in synchrony with the climate. We know that there's internal ecosystem processes that control, for example, recovery from extreme, that should in principle modulate some of these patterns. And so, but if we think about return times of high impact events that are longer than recovery periods, then we could think about a system being in equilibrium. And normally this is the case of basically biogeography, where do we have savannas versus humid forests? We know that this is driven to some extent by fire patterns that are controlled by natural variability in the tropical zone. And so my argument here would then be that part of the stochastic variability that we see in ecological dynamics, and we can interpret this as disturbance events, is very likely to be in part explained by the stochastic variability in the climatic drivers. And even though the predictability of the climatic drivers is also low, as I mentioned before, this is not unhelpful information, because it might still help us to understand the processes that drive the system. And one example of this is the El Niño Southern Oscillation that drives variability in the global carbon cycle. I think almost everyone here has heard about the El Nino. So during an El Nino event, we have drought patterns in most of the land areas in the tropics. This drives fires also in Southeast Asia and in Australia. And normally we have extremely low global land sink. And when we have a La Nina year, which would be the opposite, we can also have extremely positive global events. Other patterns exist that are maybe less familiar to most people, but we've looked at many of these patterns. Some are global, some are regional, and we tried to quantify how much of the land surface variability in gross primary production could actually be explained by variability in these patterns of natural climate variability. And we've shown that above 80% of vegetation activity in the globe can be linked to variability in some of these patterns. Some of these are semi-periodic, so the El Nino Southern Oscillation, the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, and the Pacific decadal oscillation. And then there's other patterns that are important regionally, and these do not have a clear periodicity, which makes it, of course, harder to predict. So in a change in climate, we can think about ecological variability being driven by a function of natural climate variability that can change under increased changed sensitivity to climate. Internal dynamics can also maybe change due to environmental change. And then we can add a function of climate change. And then we can think that we can kind of move to increased stress conditions and the climate change. And of course, the way a change in the climate forcing is then translated into a change in the ecological drivers is also not necessarily linear. What matters here is that in principle, we expect stress return times to become shorter. And sometimes we might risk that they are shorter than recovery periods. And we can also have kind of clusters of more frequent and extreme stress. If we think about recent extreme events, and again, I'm going back to the summer 2018 in Europe, this was actually the case that these events were triggered by some pattern of natural variability, so some kind of anomaly in atmospheric circulation. So this is a part of the North Atlantic Oscillation, and then a wave 7 pattern, which is kind of a pattern in which the jet stream flows across the Northern Hemisphere. And both of these brought less precipitation to much of the regions that were affected by drought in summer. And the combination of the two really explains the extreme drought. But then, of course, the intensity of the drought was further amplified by the fact that the atmosphere is a little bit warmer, and therefore the potential for soil dryness is even stronger. And so there is an atmospheric dynamics component that is likely to be, to some extent, stochastic, but then this is amplified by climate change. Another example are the bushfires in Australia in 2019 and 20. And again, there's some papers showing that this extreme fire season was brought about by a combination of 3 patterns. So the phase of the El Nino Southern Oscillation, a phase of the Indian Ocean Dipole, and another phase of the Southern Annular Mode, which are basically patterns of atmospheric variability in this region. And all of them affect, to some extent, rainfall and temperature patterns in Australia. And a particularly rare combination of these 3 modes led to very hot conditions, very dry conditions, and also very high fire danger indices. But then also the intensity of the event that was reached was likely amplified by the fact that we live in a warmer world than we did some decades ago. And so we can think about these extreme events or high impact ecological events as being triggered by atmospheric dynamics that is to some extent stochastic, unpredictable, and they are made more intense or more frequent by climate change. There's some discussion about whether climate change also affects atmospheric dynamics, but I will not go into it. And so you might be thinking now, why should you care about natural variability in the climate system if what we want to do is to look at risks of climate change to ecosystems and, for example, tree mortality events? Well, a big reason for this is that when we look at future climate projections, or also when we look at the past, we normally look at mean changes. And here I'm showing results of so changes in mean land surface temperature over the tropics from the CSM climate model compared to the CRU TS4 observation-based temperatures, bias corrected. And first thing you can see is that the red line agrees relatively well with the trend in the black line, not necessarily the variability from year to year. But what we have here in the thin lines are 50 simulations where the initial conditions were perturbed a little bit. So each time the model ran, it started with slightly different initial conditions, and then the model runs forward with exactly the same climate forcing, processes, etc. And you can see that there's a very large spread between the different simulations. And then you can also see that some temperatures that are quite extreme in the observational record can also be matched, not very often, but sometimes by some of these simulations. And basically what the simulations reflect is precisely the uncertainty in the climate due to this internal natural variability in the system. And so we can think about each of these simulations being possible worlds fully consistent with climate change, because they all show this increasing trend in the last 20 or 30 years, fully consistent with the same physics, same forcings, etc., but just slightly different because we started from slightly different conditions. And then we can also think about our world as one possible realization of all these possible 50 worlds. And the point here is that when we look at only one realization, which is our present world, the things we measure, we cannot know by just looking at how extreme an event is compared to the observations in black, whether this is just because of, or whether this is a sign of climate change and some change in the forcing, or whether it might be due to internal variability. And this matters even more when we think about future trends. And here is where I hope I can get you fully convinced that we need to think about these things when we think about tree mortality, because when we look at future projections of changes in climate variables, we can end up with very different scenarios depending on whether we happen to choose one of these simulations that, for example, for Seattle in Washington shows a wetting trend, so increase in precipitation, or a very strong drying trend. And in some regions, the spread due to internal variability can be so large that it's actually unclear in which direction we might be going. And all of these trajectories might still be fully consistent with a climate change scenario. And you can see here that for the globe, for example, the simulations agree quite well. So it's really at the regional scale, but it's at the regional scale also that we know these high impact events matter. And normally when we look at future projections, we look at the average of these simulations. But this is, Clara Deser has a very nice paper where she says, well, basically this is what we expect and this is what we get. So either this or this scenarios, a very wetting scenario or a very drying scenario, we can get both of these. And so to attribute high impact extreme events, in climate science, there's a way to attribute extreme events by looking at when some event departs from this variability expected by natural variability in a given reference period. And I hope that it is clear now that if we think about drivers of things like tree mortality, we might need to be able to separate or to know whether we are looking at a change that is driven by climate change or whether it's just maybe by chance and driven by natural variability. And I know I should be finishing soon. I hope I will take less than 10 minutes now. But we can do the same in terms of ecological impacts. So we could in principle plug in these different climate scenarios to our framework to look at how climate drivers translate into hazards and the resulting impacts, and calculate expected impacts under climate change, and then calculate expected impacts under pre-industrial climate. And then by looking at their difference, we could basically define some threshold for a given event and be able to say how much of this impact can be attributed to anthropogenic climate change versus how much it can be basically simply due to natural variability in the climate system. I would just like to give an example on where this might come to some practical applications. And I would like to go back again to the European tree mortality in the last 3 or almost 4 years now. And this paper by Cornelius Senf and Rupert Seidel just came out showing that for Central Europe, the disturbance anomalies in 2018, 19, and 20 is really outside of the range of the past reference period starting in 1986. And at least in Germany, there's a lot of discussion about this tree mortality episode. What does it mean in terms of management and planning for the future century and so on. And well, we know that these 3 years were extremely hot and dry. And so here I'm showing soil moisture anomalies for summer versus temperature anomalies for summer. And this is the bivariate, so the two-variate distribution from observation-based reanalysis, Euro 5, since 1950. And we can see that 2018 clearly stood out of the distribution, 2019 again as well. And 2020, even though it was not extremely or as extremely hot as the other years, it was still, when we look at the combination of the two variables, it was still extremely hot and dry. And so the question here is, could such a combination of 3 extreme hot and dry years or extreme hot and dry summers happen by chance or mainly by just natural variability in the climate system? And to answer this, we've looked at simulations of soil moisture and temperature over Central Europe, so over the same domain, by the Max Planck ESM Earth system model. And then we looked at 10 different simulations with perturbed initial conditions. So again, like these little lines that I've shown in the figure before. And so these 10 different simulations can basically represent 10 possible worlds consistent with the present day climate. One of the things that we see is that the MPI-ESM simulates quite well the distribution of temperatures. It tends to be a little bit on the wetter side compared to the observations. But in any case, the distributions are relatively similar. And then what we do is, first we try to calculate the probability of these 3 extreme events, or actually of all the years, given the long-term distribution. And this is basically what I'm showing here, where we can see that a few extreme events with very low probabilities of happening in the historical record. And these last 3 summers are the only sequence of extreme events. So there were a few, 2003, we know it was very hot and dry, 1993, and a few others in the past. And then we can do the same for all these 10 simulations by the Max Planck Earth System model. And this is a little bit messy here, but basically this is the same thing that I was showing before. So this little cluster of 3 hot and dry summers. And each of these horizontal lines show one possible world. And the red or pink events are hot or hot and dry events. And then the yellow ones are extremely dry. So one of the things that we see is that the Max Planck, so the model does simulate some clusters of hot and dry events. And actually some simulations show clusters of extreme events happening in the past for some simulations, but not for others, right? So I mean, there's some simulations where not much is happening. One thing that becomes apparent when we look at these long-term trends is that in the last 2 decades, the hot and dry events become more frequent compared to just dry extreme events. But still, I mean, this shows that probably this 2018-2020 event is, again, probably a combination of both. And in principle, we should be able to try to calculate the fraction of the impacts that was due to climate change versus natural variability. So in principle, we could do this with models and again, try to go from this part of the framework to look at how this affected the hazards, for example, the bark beetle outbreaks and the drought intensity, and then translate it into impacts. But for this, we would need models that are able to simulate the legacies from one extreme event to the next, because it's really this damage that also affects the impact the year after. And as I showed before, we see this declining trajectory in about 20% of the region. But when we did the same, or we tried to compare this with model simulations of GPP, the models were able to simulate the difference, so the impact of the 2018 drought, but in 2019, they didn't simulate, well, a negative anomaly, mostly because they practically simulated no legacy effects. So models are probably not there yet, but there's a lot of development in many processes that could bring us there relatively soon. And so to finish today, I guess what I try to, the message I try to bring here today is that closer integration of hydrometeorology, climate science, and ecology can help improving understanding about the drivers of ecological variability, because it allows us to have a systemic perspective of all the relevant system components. This is probably even more important when we think about high impact ecological events, because they're rare and very hard to predict. And my feeling is that that part of this unpredictability is related to the fact that natural variability in the climate system controls the occurrence of extreme events, which in turn controls the occurrence of high impact ecological events. We know that climate change can make these events more intense or more frequent, and can also change ecosystem properties and internal dynamics that can further increase the likelihood of high impact ecological events in the future. And again, because natural variability leads to large uncertainties in future climate projections, we probably should not be looking at the mean changes when we try to project impacts of climate change on ecosystems, because we might be not seeing the one possible simulation that has a cluster of 3 hot and dry years, or that has some relatively low probability event, but that can trigger very strong impacts. And so bringing this perspective of natural variability and uncertainty in the future climate projections, I think would be very helpful when we try to project the future of our forests and anticipate things like tree mortality and forest stability, management decisions, and so on. And with this, I would like to thank you. And I think I'm over my time.
Thank you, Anna, for the nice talk. So we are open for questions now. We still have a couple of minutes to ask some questions. If you have questions, please post them into the Q&A thread, and I'm gonna then read them out to Anna. So one question from you, Lee, was within your framework, can there also be feedbacks back into the climate system? So whether the changes you see in EVI, for example, kind of whether they affect then again local climate change due to feedbacks, and do you consider this into your models?
That's a good point. I think in principle, you could, in the sense, like I've shown how for the warm spring in 2018, that increase in GPP, so productivity, resulted in an increase in ET, which contributed to about half of the drop. So I guess in principle, one could look at how ecological effects translate at least into the hazard. I mean, I take it that the climate drivers, we would just use them from kind of base them on observations. But in principle, I think this could be at least included.
Okay, so second question by Istvan Dukel is, what do you think are the key mechanisms which are missing in ESMs to simulate those disturbance legacies? So you show that it doesn't, like the simulations do not really match the observations. So what do we need to change in the models to better match the observations?
Well, I will name, I guess, top priority. I think there's the whole aspect of drought damage and drought legacies through things like damage by embolism, loss of hydraulic conductivity, even mortality is also not so well represented. And so, but this is currently being developed by several groups. Another aspect is the non-structural carbon reserves that are really important. First, when you think about repair of the damages, the seasons, like the years after, but also allocation of these reserves to mobilize defense mechanisms against bark beetles, for example. And again, this is not, well, it's actually now included in some models, but not in the CMIP6 global ESM simulations for sure. And the third aspect, I could name more, but I think a third aspect is this disturbance component, right? So, I mean, some models do have fire, but no models have proper representation of things like bioptic disturbance, wind damage, and then also the interactions between these disturbances that we also know are really important. And the latest IPCC report, I mean, there's a sentence there saying that basically, we think that the magnitude of this feedback is positive, so that it contributes to increased climate change, but the magnitude is basically unconstrained.
Okay, so just to a follow-up question by Kim Novick, who also asked about missing parts in the models, but also missing parts on the data side. So what additional data streams would be needed to improve the models? Yes,
so, well, data on disturbances. Well, you are doing lots of work on this, Cornelius, so it's very helpful. But really having this large scale long-term, and especially this long-term is really important, data on disturbance occurrence, but then also the drivers, so that we are able to separate between, you know, disturbance from drought versus wind versus biotic effects and so on. And then, well, ideally, of course, we have FluxNet data, for example, that have all these nice global coverage of carbon fluxes, water fluxes, but there's many other things that are not there and that would be very helpful to understand certain responses, like, for example, allocation to different parts of the system, soil properties, and I mean, sap flow. I mean, there's also a different network on sap flow measurements, but having all these things together, I think, would be really important to get this perspective of the whole system.
Perfect, thanks. So a question by Sue Quick. So she is asking about those like critical trigger points, or those critical transitions. So what's your opinion on predicting those? Do you think that having those models, we will be actually able to get a better idea about those trigger points, whether we are close or far away?
So I think if we bring this natural climate variability perspective, right, that we look not just at the mean, but also possibly rare events that are still, plausible in the future, then what we need is our impact models that are able to simulate nonlinear responses to these events, again, through mortality or these cascades of disturbances and things like that. And so I don't think, or I think we might be able to do this only partly using statistical methods. We really need mechanistic models so that we can simulate all these complex interactions properly.
Perfect. So a question by Martin de Kauwe. So he wonders whether the winter conditions between those drought years, whether they also had an effect. And so is it also the winters that play an important role for recovery, and the conditions like the climatic variability within winter seasons?
It could be. I would say that the impact of winters on carbon cycle variability is and also like how they might have legacies to summer extremes is not very well studied. So I think it would be definitely good to look at that.
Okay, so we have a couple of more questions. So Alessio Colalti asks, so how reliable are those extreme scenarios produced by climate models? So are they actually getting close, or is it like an underestimation or maybe even an overestimation? Do we have an idea about the reliability or uncertainties of those extremes?
Well, I think, again, the kind of Earth system models at very coarse resolution might also miss some of these very high extreme events. But I know that in the climate community, there's also ways to overcome this by, trying to kind of force the models to represent some scenarios of interest, and or by going in higher resolution and using regional climate models where you can again have all these different possible worlds, but at much finer resolutions where you can resolve different processes. I mean, as ecological models, climate models are also not yet perfect, and for sure extreme events are one of the big uncertainties. But we have to live with it. And one thing one can also do is to design scenarios based on recent events, and we can kind of superimpose them on the future scenarios and try to think what would happen if a summer like 2018 would happen in 20 or 30 years.
Okay, cool. Thanks a lot. So we are running out of time. There are some more questions. Sorry if we didn't pick your question. We try to get as many as possible out there, but there's only limited time. But thanks, Anna, for answering these questions, and I hand over to Nadine for some final words.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you all for the exciting seminar, particularly Anna and everybody for participating in the discussion. And I'm sure, Anna, you made us clearly aware of that a drought is not a drought. And in order to address tree mortality better in the future, we should better understand the interplay between the physics of the extremes and their impacts. To all others, I want to say, please stay tuned for our next seminar, which should take place in March. In order to not miss another seminar, you can always check on our website where they are also highlighted. You can follow us also on Twitter, or you can even consider becoming a member of our network. Then you for sure get an invitation for the next seminar. So thank you very much again to everybody. Have a great day, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. And we're looking forward to our next seminar and having you here again. Bye-bye.